And we've seen a couple of cases recently that were pretty successful. There's what I'm calling the Swiss grandmothers climate change case, and there's the Montana youth case, which people may have heard of. What were some of the arguments that were being used that made these cases successful?
Both of those cases were really remarkable landmark decisions in recent months. And maybe just starting with the Swiss grandmothers or the Klimasenioren case before the European Court of Human Rights. To listeners who may not know, it's a very prominent regional court that enforces the European Convention of Human Rights and upholds standards around what is needed to protect human rights. So the European Court, in issuing that decision earlier this year in March, it was really became the first international court to recognize climate change as a human rights crisis, triggering legal obligations under human rights law, finding that the failure to act adequately to mitigate climate change, to curb greenhouse gas emissions, violates legal obligations under international human rights law and violates human rights of people. This is the first time an international court really told a major global economy, you need to do more on climate change. Like, your failure to take sufficiently robust, rapid, and urgent action at a sufficient scale in line with the science was a breach of its obligations under human rights law. And I think that, just those findings alone are really significant and game changing. And it's because it doesn't only pertain to Switzerland, which is the government that was immediately bound by the decision. It's relevant to all, number one, across Europe, to all of the member states of the Council of Europe who are bound by the European Convention on Human Rights. They have the same obligation to protect human rights from climate change and its consequences. And so, they got a strong signal that if they don't close the gap between their climate action or inaction and what science shows is clearly necessary to prevent further harm to human rights, then they too might face legal consequences. So it sent that really strong signal, and I think also sent a signal to courts and to advocates around the world. Its impacts are not limited to Europe by any means.
And the Youth Montana case, was that equally successful because it was grounded in science?
So this was a case actually that wasn't just challenging, as so many climate cases to date have done, inadequate action on the part of the state, but was actually challenging the way in which a state's policies or conduct can make climate change worse or are making climate change worse. And in this case, specifically, the challenging this practice and policy of the state, a law that prohibited consideration of climate change in reviewing fossil fuel projects. And it was found that that's unlawful. You can't ignore the climate consequences of fossil fuels when you're deciding whether or not to authorize and pursue these projects. And I think it was historic not only because of the way that the plaintiffs used the courtroom really as a platform to convey impacts and lay out the science really cogently, which was reflected in that court's decision in a compelling way, and they kind of walked through in this very stepwise, logical way. Here are the facts, and they're really not in contest, and therefore the conclusions follow. But also because they relied on the right to a healthy environment. And so one of the things that links these cases is really reliance on rights, on human rights, and the consequent duties that governments have.
There's a lot of cases, almost too many to keep track of, even if you're just looking at the cases against the oil companies specifically, either in the US or globally. And a lot of these surround like climate deception or plastics deception or public nuisance cases or things like this. And then one that's being closely watched is against Shell in the Netherlands. So,
Right.
what are these arguments that the plaintiffs are making to build their case against the oil companies?
So part of the arguments that are being put forward are about the plain science and the reality that, as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has affirmed time and again, that it is not possible to prevent catastrophic warming or to keep warming limit warming, to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels without addressing the primary cause of climate change, and that is fossil fuels. We have to curb and reduce and eliminate fossil dependence on fossil fuels, which are responsible for well over 85% of CO2 emissions, the vast majority, right? But what has enabled these suits against corporations is A number of things. One is that the science has evolved to be able to actually trace these known causes of climate change to consequences that we are seeing around the world. This body of attribution science, it makes it more possible to say these sources of greenhouse gas emissions that are driving the climate crisis, that climate change can be linked to massive devastating consequences. And therefore we have the building blocks of accountability. We can trace it back. And so that science is one piece of it, but it's also taking on the revelations that just keep coming, frankly, of the ways in which the industry has played an active role in derailing climate action for years. So it's not only that its products are causing harm, but that it knew its products would cause harm and are causing harm, and yet it continued to expand their production and to market them in ways initially by denying the climate problem, but then that's shifted. We've seen a shift from denial and delay around climate action and the inevitable need to get the world off of fossil fuels to deception and deflection. And we're really in this era now where the fossil fuel industry has taken on the tack of really trying to present itself as part of the solution, not the central cause of the problem, which we know it is, right? And so now the battle is really about what constitutes a real solution to climate change. So we've seen in the United States, certainly there are dozens of lawsuits now by cities and states taking on the fossil fuel industry on both these fronts, on both the harm that its products have caused. And so some of them are cost recovery actions, are actually trying to say, hey, polluters who've caused massively this problem that we are now paying to adapt to and to address, but also taking on the deception, the consumer fraud and deception, the ways in which their withholding of information or their disinformation has shaped consumer practices, whether people buy or don't buy or continue to believe that fossil fuels are we need to get off of them to address climate change. So